board as well. Excellent. Good evening, friends. Welcome, welcome. Come on in. Good to be with you on a Monday evening. It's balmy and fall-like in Spokane, Washington. David, what's it like over in Atlanta right now?
It's been lovely. It's not 100 degrees anymore. So you wear a jacket in the morning, maybe late at night. Yeah, it's nice. Fall has come.
So that's awesome. Yeah, friends, wherever you're calling in from, if you're up for it, we'd love to see who you are and maybe where you're calling in from. That'll be fun for David and I to see you and understand a little bit more about who we're talking to. And then, you know, as you're coming in as well, what brought you to a conversation about faith and politics and democracy on a Monday evening? I know what brought me here. We're going to dive into that. I know what brought David here. We'd love to hear what brought you here if you're up for sharing. So in the comment section, your name, where you're calling in from, and what brought you into a conversation about this. And then the second thing I really want to draw your attention to, friends, of course, is the Q&A feature. And so the way that we're going to do Q&A throughout this time is as questions emerge for you, because I bet there's a question even that that you brought with you into this conversation. As they emerge, hit them into the Q&A. We want to see them unfold regularly throughout the evening. And then there's going to be a moment where David and I are just going to pause the conversation, and he's going to peruse the questions, and then we're going to tackle them together. So that's how we want to see that happen. So don't wait, just practice asking a question. Don't worry about saying it well. Just demonstrate some curiosity with us, and we'll see where that takes us. My name is Jared Swigart. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Global Immersion. And for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a peacemaking training organization that forms everyday peacemakers and reconciling leaders to mend internal, interpersonal, and institutional divides. We do this through two primary ways. One is immersive formation, like our leadership cohorts, leadership and team coaching, and daily contemplative prayer gatherings, but also inspiring media like the Everyday Peacemaking podcast that we just relaunched with an episode last week, and live conversations like these. There are really three reasons why we do live conversations like these. First of all, education. Here's our hunch. Our vision is not 2020. My perspective is not fully right, and it's always partially wrong. And so we need exposure to things that we don't yet understand. And so we bring folks like David and others into conversation with us to grow our knowledge, because that's really critical for us. So education. Number two, transformation. Information learning is not the same thing as transformation. And so we recognize as peacemakers that we need to become substantively different kinds of people, not just smarter people. We need to become substantively different kinds of people. So these conversations are actually meant to be a catalyst for our ongoing formation. And three, mobilization. We're not created to make change alone, friends. We need to link arms and take practical steps in the direction of repair together. You're going to hear a couple of invitations for how this conversation will be a launch pad into some communal learning where we can link our arms together in just a little bit. Tonight's conversation is, I would say it's years in the making. David, I don't know how you would say it, but like for me, I want to go back a couple of years to my journey through seminary, in which Dr. David Gushee and Dr. Glenn Stasson's book, Kingdom Ethics, was a paradigm-altering book for me. It was probably the most important book that I read throughout my entire seminary career, in that it created language for some of my biggest questions and internal wonderings, longings. And then, as fate, or maybe as God would have it, David and I were roommates together in, I think it was definitely my first time into Israel-Palestine. David, was it your first time as well?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
So here I go from, like, you know, literary mentor to now getting to share a room with David as we navigated one of the most complex conflicts in the world, which, by the way, I leave for tomorrow. So I'm excited to get back into that space with a delegation of leaders from here. And by day, we would navigate this conflict. And then by evening, any chance I had the opportunity, I would find myself next to David, just kind of processing with him what we just experienced and wondering out loud and hearing him reflect as a theologian and a Christian ethicist on what it was that we had just experienced. But it was so great because I also got to hear some of his own visceral, raw reflections as well. And so that was critical for me. So then from kingdom ethics, and many of you on this list can name off maybe 1 or 5 or 20 of his over 20 books, but from kingdom ethics through changing our minds to after evangelicalism, David has been creating language for many of us, I think, as we've sought to sort out the complexity of living the Jesus way of life in the midst of this moment of rapid discontinuous change. And I think the language created in Defending Democracy is just another one of those books for us. It's the right book, I think, with the right, most accessible language at a really critical time in US American, and I would argue global history. And so in addition to being an author of over 20 books, he's a professor and a pastor, and this is what I love most. He's committed to companioning next generation Christian courageous leaders. And that's not his language, that's my language, as I've observed the way that he companions this emerging generation of leaders to hold the baton of moral, ethical, Christian courageous leadership. He's been a featured faculty in our flagship leadership cohort called Journey of Hope, where this year's cohort got the privilege of getting really first access to the content that's in the book and that what you're going to hear tonight. Ultimately, he's a mentor and a trusted friend, and he's not merely a thought leader. And that's probably why he's on the screen with us. If you're familiar with Global Immersion at all, we don't just bring thought leaders into conversation with us. We bring thought leaders who are embedded practitioners into conversation with us, because this stuff has to sink from our brains into our bodies for it to actually affect the change that's possible in the world. He's a peacemaking practitioner, he's a father, and he's a grandfather who understands and I think shares our urgency for the moment that we find ourselves in. And tonight he's here to offer us some toeholds, I think, to help us make sense of some of what we're experiencing and what we're wondering, as well as in our journey as we move toward a faith that propels restoration. And so I'm really, really excited to dive into the conversation. But before we do, 3 framing thoughts for tonight. And I wrote these down just because I want to be really thoughtful about them. First, the themes that we're going to explore tonight are best examined with ourselves in mind. I want to invite us not to fall prey to the othering and the fable making and the finger pointing that has divided us. Transformation at scale begins with individuals like you and I who are willing to engage in the deep work of self-interrogation. So some of us might be coming in saying, I need language to understand those people on the other side of my ideological, theological spectrum so that I can fill in blank. When in fact, many of us have been socialized into the very religion that I think we're going to come to understand at a deeper level this evening. So let's enter into this space with a posture of confession and the posture of self-interrogation. I think that's where we need to start. We need to examine this right here. Number 2, many of us have been socialized into the religion that David will unpack for us tonight. Some of us have been deeply wounded by it. Many of us are pretty cynical about it. And I imagine that nearly all of us have relationships with folks who remain entrenched within it. And so I want to invite us to enter into this conversation committed to gentleness with ourselves and with compassion for others. And third, David and I both recognize the limitations of one book and one conversation to affect lives and change in our lives and institutions. And so to address that, David and I are teaming up together to offer a live 3-part virtual workshop fusing the themes of his book with the training that we need for our own ongoing formation and organizational and congregational transformation. So I want you to understand that tonight is really, it's a standalone experience that you're welcome to learn and benefit from. And it's a launch pad into a formational pathway guided by David and I, where we're going to forge some community and go deeper together. So if you're looking for some companionship in this journey from fidelity to a religion that promotes domination to a faith that propels restoration, if you're looking for other people who are wanting to take that journey with you, and if you're looking for some pilgrim guides, some practitioners who have thought pretty deeply about these things and offer some skill set around how we actually transform as human beings and as institutions, then you're going to want to be a part of the workshop that begins on October 18. It's free, funded by our community of funders, and there will be a suggested donation. But don't let finance be an obstacle. Get in this and let's journey together with community. I'll come back to that in a little bit this evening. So those are my framing thoughts: self-examination, gentleness with self, compassion with others. And if you're ready to not just move from consuming data from consuming data into a communal journey, a formational learning journey, stay tuned and join us in this workshop. Okay. All that said, as questions come to mind, populate the Q&A. It's awesome to see what's happening in the chat thread, your name, where you're from, what brought you into this conversation. Use that space to connect this evening, capture quotes, post helpful links. You'll see the Global Immersion team moving in that space as well, making sure that you're one click away from everything that's mentioned here. Without any further ado, my dear friend, Dr. David Gushee, thank you for being with us tonight. I know that many on listening live and who will be listening to this recording are familiar with you, mostly in your writing and communicating. I wonder if they're as familiar with you, the human being who lives behind all of that. And so tell us a little bit about you, and then in your introduction, tell us some of the events that led to this particular book. We'd love to hear more of that story.
Well, Jer, thank you for being one of those younger leaders of courage and vision who I get to go on this journey with, and thank you for inviting me into your community, not just tonight, but other times too. And I'm excited to be partnering in these workshops and just hanging out and thinking practically. I grew up in the shadow of Washington, D.C. My father worked for the federal government, the Library of Congress. Eventually, I met my future wife. Her father worked for the Department of Education. I lived in Vienna, Virginia. Pretty much 75% of my friends, their parents were in the government. It was the 1970s. Things were not perfect or anything, but there was a sense of the significance of serving the United States government in the civil service. My father worked on energy and environmental policy legislation that actually began to clean up rivers and clean up the air, and set some energy policy even before we knew about climate change much. So what's in my marrow, before I became a Christian, what was in my marrow was a sense of the significance of public service, the strengths of our democracy, the smart people who felt called to serve the country, what can happen when people work together to solve problems. And so I became a Christian as a born-again Southern Baptist when I was 16 years old. And so for a little while, all I was interested in was personal spirituality and the Bible and when is Jesus coming back and evangelizing all my friends. So no, I became an evangelical, actually kind of a fundamentalist for a while. But then I realized that it was the combination of that passionate personal faith in Christ and the concern about the world and the country and its problems that was where my heartbeat was. And so when I discovered the discipline of Christian ethics in seminary with Glenn Stassen and Paul Simmons at Southern Baptist Seminary, I found my home. It brought together, you might say, the public service and concern for the world of my childhood and the devoted faith of my adolescence. And so I've been doing Christian ethics since really started in seminary. I got a PhD in 1993. I've been doing this for 30 years. I was taught ethics by an older generation that had lived through World War II and the Cold War. My main professor was of German background, and he he had deeply, deeply internalized the lessons of the rise of Nazism, genocide, Holocaust, as well as the dangers of communism, and also the dangers of the weapons that we were developing that could destroy the world over many, many times. While he was not, Glenn Stassen I'm talking about here, while he was not an uncritical defender of democracy, there was no question that democracy was the best available or the least bad political system that had ever been developed on the planet, far preferable to dictatorship and monarchy and communism, fascism, and so on. I was also taught a way of engaging public life that says Christian ethics helps the church not just to be faithful in our way of life as followers of Jesus, but also it gives us guidance as to what to say to policymakers. We are supposed to bear public witness and talk about things like climate change or racism or tax law or economics or whatever. But here's what's changed, Jer. The ethics I was taught assumed a stable, functioning democracy. So you have a democracy, you have Congress, and it passes laws, and you have presidents who sign good laws, and you have elections, and when people lose, they leave, and they go to the inauguration of the next person and say, all the best to you. And in other words, you talked about rapid, discontinuous change. The last 8 years have been a period for me of rapid, discontinuous change in the assumptions by which I do my work as an ethicist, symbolized most profoundly by the challenging of the results of the November 2020 election and then what happened on January 6th. That's a new world for the United States. So what motivated the book was my shock at that event, but also Christian support in some quarters and presence in that event. And post all of that, what it seemed to me to be the spread of fundamentally undemocratic or anti-democratic ideas among a certain kind of Christian part of the population. It's not the majority, but it's a lot, who new frontiers of possibility have been opened for them by the events of these last years. And those new frontiers are fundamentally threatening to democracy, and fundamentally, I think, wrong for Christians to go down that path. And so my book was motivated by all of that. Once I dug in and began doing the analytical work, I was able to bring in another love of mine. I almost did a PhD in international relations, Jerry. I don't think anybody knows that. It has now been revealed.
Yeah. Good. First here on this channel. I love it.
That's right. I almost did a PhD in international relations. And so I've spent a lot of my adult life also reading and studying other countries. Right. And so once I started to do the analysis of what went wrong in America, it didn't take long to see that similar patterns were happening in other countries. And so the book treats that as well.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I want to get to, because perhaps even in our American exceptionalism, we think that our problems are uniquely ours. And what I think you do so well in the book is you actually unpack the global phenomenon that is the ARC, or the authoritarian reactionary Christian politics, that we'll unpack here in just a moment. So I want us eventually to get there. I want to say as well, like, what I find unique about this book, as compared to maybe the last 3 or 4 books that you've written, I feel like some of your own story of transformation. I read some of your previous works as publicly confessional, and I think that adds a beauty to what you're writing. This one is beautiful in a different kind of way, I think, because it really called upon your analytical diagnosis, careful research. So just give us a second to help us understand what this book is and what this isn't, and then I want to dive into some of its themes.
Yeah, thanks. It's not a diatribe, even though the title might sound pretty provocative. It's not just another attack on conservative Christians. It's not a travelogue where I tell all of my best stories about engaging in politics. I've got some stories I could tell. There's a few of them in there, but not much. It's really not about me. Mm-hmm. I would say, here's an interesting thing. I was a weekly columnist for Religion News Service when Donald Trump became president. Mm-hmm. And I was so destabilized by the way he conducted himself in office that I was like at a loss for words. Within about a year of the beginning of his presidency, I gave up my Religion News Service column because I could not find the words to process what I was witnessing. It was too different and too frightening. So in one sense, what I'm doing is processing what we've all been witnessing. It just took me some time, some distance. But it is an effort to really do two things. It's classic ethics, like what is really happening here and what's going wrong? What do we name that? And what resources do we have within the Christian tradition to do better? So it's analysis and you might say diagnosis and prescription. Classic ethics. It's motivated by the the 2024 election is coming. I think we're going to have quite a year in 2024 in this country, and I wanted to give my best shot at equipping Christians who would like to be able to address both of those things. What is the problem, and what can we bring to it that can help us do better? It's about that.
Yeah. That's I'm super grateful for it because I think for those of us listening in, we probably all saw 25 different books pop off in the first, in the months in the immediate aftermath of, say, the 2020 election or post January 6th. And lots of it was helpful literature, and I really appreciated it. What I see and experience in this book, David, is that it has been, you've allowed it to marinate and season, giving me the kind of analysis that I think I've been waiting for. And so let's dive into it. Yes, the title, wildly provocative, and I want to play with it a little bit. Again, the title being "Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies." Early in the book, pages 8 and 9, for those of you who are keeping track, write this down. Pages 8 and 9, you do an incredible job of unpacking democracy. And as I was reading it, I was even recognizing for myself how thin my understanding of democracy is. And so I want to start with your understanding of democracy. You even go so far as to say that it's a major achievement. And so help us understand democracy as you understand it, as well as what makes for a healthy democracy. And then I want to hear your analysis on democracy as it stands today.
Yeah. Though a little bit of history, though the Athenians attempted democracy 2,500 years ago, that experiment collapsed partly because of the flaws in their model. When the Romans came along, they had a republic that had some democratic elements, but it collapsed into dictatorship that lasted for centuries. There was not a serious attempt at democracy again until beginning in the stirrings in the 17th century and then revolutions in the 18th century. So democracy, as we understand it in this sense, is relatively recent in human history. It is I define it as shorthand, rule of the people without rule of the mob, because the rule of law governs what the people's representatives are allowed to do. So it's majority rule, popular sovereignty, universal franchise, all citizens have a vote, equal franchise power, competitive, free and fair elections with the results respected by the winners and the losers, a portfolio of rights guarantees, including freedom of speech and the press. There are other citizen liberties, and with an emphasis on the protection of the rights of minorities, including religious minorities. There's a commitment to the rule of law grounded in a constitution written by the people and respected by everyone in the society. So you might say modern democracy is rule of the people constrained by the rule of law. It is indeed a major achievement, because authoritarian forms of government have tended to dominate. So not rule of the people, but rule of the one, or rule of a few, rule of a clan or a tribe, or just whoever's the most ruthless. Without rule of law, the ruler is the one who says what the rules are, right? If Vladimir Putin wants you to go to jail, you're going to go to jail, right? There is no, in an authoritarian system, there is not freedom of speech or the press or other kinds of rights for the citizenry. There's not a meaningful constitution. There's not the rule of law, but the rule of a person. There's not protections from the tyrannical whim of a ruler. So to be able to, over centuries, gradually slough off tyranny and authoritarianism and choose democracy was a major human achievement. And our version of it has been flawed from the beginning, for sure, but it is hundreds of years old. It is the most stable democratic political order in the world, of the longest duration. And all of that is now shaky in a way that it hadn't been until just a few years ago.
So before we get to your analysis of democracy in this moment in time, I would imagine that some would critique you as propping up democracy as like God's design for governance on the planet. I heard you earlier say that democracy is the best, in your view, the best form of governance that we have right now. Can you talk to us a little bit about, like, are you saying democracy is like God's design? This is like the Christian way of governance, or are you saying something different here?
Something different. I like what Reinhold Niebuhr says. He said, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. Sorry for the old gender exclusive language back in the day, but Reinhold Niebuhr basically said, democracy, well, it was a product both of Christian insights and of liberal Enlightenment insights. It was both. It was early modern Christianity plus early Enlightenment gives us early democracy. And it reflected insights gained from both traditions, both early liberalism and Christianity. Not every version of Christianity, but some that were especially pro-democratic. Nobody should try to make the claim that, like, there's one, God-designed political system for human civilization. My claim is that it has proven to be the best yet developed, given human nature, and its consequences have tended to be better than the alternatives of authoritarian or anarchy, kind of situations. Yeah.
And in your title, I mean, the fact that defending democracy is in it, it would indicate that your analysis is that democracy here is not doing well. It's fragile. Talk to us a little. Give us your analysis, and then we're going to talk about why.
Yeah. Well, no political system, including the U.S. one, is without flaws. I think it's become clear, mainly under the stresses of the last 5 or 6 years, that there are some structural weaknesses in our Constitution that need to be addressed, but we're too divided to address them. A couple of them include the Electoral College really is not a good idea, and 2/3 of Americans, I saw a poll today, would like to have just popular vote for president. And the way the Senate is set up and the rules of the Senate, it's not representative and it doesn't work very well. So those are some things that need to be reformed, right? So that's there. Also, our polarization into two main camps, left and right, is putting enormous pressure on our democracy. It's definitely further advanced than it was in the 60s and early 70s when I was coming along. The sense of the other as enemy with a capital E has dramatically accelerated. And actually, in my study of pre-war France, that is pre-World War II, I was able to find that level of left-right polarization is very dangerous for democracy, because in a sense, people hate the other more than they love preserving the society and the government that they have. Anything to destroy the other. And once you get there, a democracy is in trouble. And then I think a new development is we had a president articulate and embrace authoritarian strategies in a way that had never been done before. And so we had the example from the very top, both in rhetoric and eventually in action after the November election. And a lot of Christians went along with him because they were loyal to him and they believed in him. And so structural weaknesses, deep polarization, and new pioneering in illiberalism or undemocratic action on the part of a president and his top people helps to at least thumbnail where we are now.
Mm-hmm. So democracy then, as I'm following the thread, democracy is a major achievement worth defending. At current time, it's wildly fragile, probably more fragile than any of us are even fully aware of.
And if you look at other countries, you see democracies collapse all the time.
Right.
Right. You can have a democracy for a while and it can go away. You can have what looks like a democracy and then its structures get so undermined that it's not really a democracy anymore. It's pretend democracy, right? Our democracy is like 240 years old. So it has some ballast to it. It has some stability and some checks and balances, as we were taught in civics classes a long time ago. By the way, Jared, one thing you said, your understanding of democracy was thin. I thought my understanding of democracy was relatively thin until I studied this. None of us are studying in a serious way the political system of our own country, which helps to make it vulnerable.
Right, it does. And I think in part because our understanding is so thin, I think it maybe even emboldens us to just simply lob grenades and launch accusations and critique. Because should we really understand it, we might carry a responsibility to do something more than
yes, that's exactly right. Yeah.
So let's move on then. I mean, I could sit here and have a conversation about democracy all night because I'm utterly fascinated by the concept of it. One of the things that I appreciate that you bring up in the book is that you're also not saying that democracy, as was conceived by our Constitution, was fully righteous. That not only are there structural issues, some of what you were talking about here in this call, but there are like the simple notion of in the Constitution, there are designations of who is fully human and who is not.
Right.
And so it's like, have we even achieved the ideals of the democracy that our forebears put in front of us is a question to be asking, or are we embodying that very democracy? And there is so much for us to grow. There's so much for us to talk about there. I think that's going to be good fodder for part 2 of the workshop that you and I will be hosting together. But in your title, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. So you're supposing that democracy is achievement and that it's worth defending. And in your title, at least, you're saying there is an enemy. It happens to be a Christian enemy that is threatening democracy. Talk to us all about that. And this is the framing that I think I've been waiting for, because I too, like you, have just been so unsettled by the notion of a fierce Christian, what seems mostly like a white evangelical Christian endorsement of domination and violence through politics, and without being able to really make sense of like what is going on here, really. And you offer that analysis. So talk to us about the Christian enemy of democracy, and then I want to play with that in a couple different ways after you break this down for us.
My main hypothesis of a diagnostic nature in the book is that the best term for the side that I'm concerned about, the side that I think is threatening democracy most profoundly, is authoritarian reactionary Christianity, ARC. Reactionary, meaning there's a significant chunk of Americans, and it's also true in some other countries, who are, not to put too fine a point on it, freaked out by pretty much every social change that has happened in our country since about 1962. And they tend to see these changes as a violation of their values, a violation of the Bible, a violation of God's will, a violation of what America should be. So if you think about pretty much every social change since about 1962, that's about gender, race, immigration, the role of religion in public life, patriotism, the dominance of white people, patriarchy, the dominance of men, the gay rights movement, the sexual revolution. So imagine a population that is, in one way or another, not universally the same in every issue, but in general, thinks that these changes are negative and destructive, or they're not comfortable with them. They want to go back to something different. Mm-hmm. That is almost the definition of a reactionary posture, right? Mm-hmm. Authoritarian means both, to me, both that a lot of Christians who I'm talking about don't really think in a democratic way about the structure of power in really any sector of life. Maybe they're most comfortable in churches in which one person rules with like absolute authority, like a pastor. Maybe they believe in that kind of leader in the home, the male patriarch. So authoritarianism, I argue in the book, there's a lot of authoritarianism in the Christian religious heritage that some people still have today. But more profoundly, what I'm saying is, at this point in history, some of these Christians who are reactionary to modern social changes are losing confidence that democracy can give the results that they want to change the society the way they think it should be changed. They want a counter, I have a chapter on this. They want a counter revolution to the secular revolutions that's how they view everything since the 1960s. Beginning in the 70s, the strategy for the Christian right was, let's get the right people elected and we'll have that counter-revolution. But what if the elections don't change the direction of the culture the way you want them to? Maybe you need to consider some other strategies that go beyond elections. Maybe it's time for holy war. Maybe it's time for militias. Maybe it's time for January 6th. Maybe it's time for extreme gerrymandering or using whatever means you can come up with to get the result that you believe is God's will, or that you most deeply want, or that you think protects the future for your children. Reactionary to modern changes, authoritarian as in democracy can be sacrificed or even must be sacrificed because cosmic matters are at stake.
So I'm hearing you say, and I think you even allude to this in the book, that this ideology says democracy, let's move within the democratic system so long as it's advantageous to us. But the moment it's no longer advantageous, in other words, the moment we no longer win at democracy, we're willing to suspend democracy in order to get what we want.
There are people, all you have to go is onto Twitter and watch people actually make these arguments. These arguments are being made by real people right now. And I would, but more broadly, I mean, of course, anybody can say anything on Twitter, right? But I wouldn't say it's like a moment. I think it's been a gradual buildup of frustration and anger, and I try to say in the book, I try to name the liberalizing trends that make conservative Christians uncomfortable. And not all of those liberalizing trends are to be unequivocally embraced. I'm not just a down the line liberal. Some of the trends need to be. I mean, everything needs to be critically interrogated. But the argument from the side is the major guardians of cultural power in higher education and in the administrative apparatus of government and in woke corporate America and whatever, I'm using their language, right? They're all conspiring to attempt to undermine our values. So how do we push back? We need to reclaim power in all of the sectors of society that we can. And if we can use democracy, we will. But maybe even democracy itself is not sacrosanct because the values matter more than the democracy. I think that's what I see on the right. I get it. I understand it. But it is inimical. It is inimical to democracy. It threatens democracy.
So, friends, as you're listening in, what questions are coming to mind for you? And I know for me, even, I'm just like this, coming back to my framing thoughts. this was the religion that I was socialized into. I grew up between a dairy farm and a military base in Midwestern Wisconsin. There was a particular understanding of what it meant to be Christian and American that were quite synonymous. And I'm resonating with this notion of authoritarian rule, and we use the means of democracy to accomplish our values, and oftentimes it's exclusive of people who don't share our values. So that's why I think it's resonating so deeply with me. So again, maintaining that space of personal interrogation here, rather than othering, which is where I want to go with this. I think we're in a society, David, where folks just do not lead with nuance. They don't lead with generosity. And so I can see the title of your book, people being like, oh, this guy's just playing the same game of dehumanizing people that he disagrees with, and he's naming them Christian enemies. And so I want you to help us understand how, in your title and in even naming authoritarian reactionary Christian politics, can you differentiate for us, whether you're like, are you saying that there's a group of people that are the enemy, or is there an ideology that's the enemy that's threatening? Help us understand what it is that you're saying and not saying by designating something Christian enemy.
Well, book titling is tricky.
Yeah.
There's, I mean, there are ways I could have titled the book that would have been less provocative, but not as interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
A Christian defense of democracy. Okay, that's really what the book is. I don't know that it would be flying off the shelves as it is right now with that title, right? So hopefully people will open the book. And I already got my first hate mail, so the title itself is going to evoke hate mail. Okay, so
Yeah. Yeah.
so it's already happening. But I think it's a current of thought that is growing. It's that current of thought and the strategies that go with it that I'm most concerned about. There are specific individuals who are pushing in this direction. I would consider myself to be an opponent of their work, but I would like to be in conversation with them, not just demonizing them, And I really, in the book, I actually quote from traditionalist Catholics and in the U.S. and around the world, and legal theorists who think that we need to reconsider kind of how we think about law. In other words, I'm engaging the ideas, and I think we do need to engage the ideas. Now, I would say, you talked earlier about, like, if you come from this environment, there's a fair amount of, like, and you don't really like this politics, and you see it like with your parents or grandparents or friends or pastors, whatever. There's a lot of people who are like embarrassed or ashamed of having been associated with this world and feel really alienated from it. I do know from my earlier work that a significant number of post-evangelicals, they're post because of this, right? And so maybe the analytical work here can help some people kind of understand the politics of their own parents.
And that's, yeah, keep going.
Be in conversation. Just, there's an awful lot of bomb throwing. I'm trying not to do that. I'm trying to help us understand, and then counter with some better ways of thinking about what Christianity should mean in the public square.
That's right. And I think for those of us listening in, at an absolute bare minimum, this book is a critical read, because it helps me understand my families of origin, and the religion that I was socialized into. And what it's done is it's actually increased my generosity and my compassion. It's actually humbled me, because I think it's easy for me to move into a space of enlightenment and entitlement and arrogance, and like, look at the journey that I'm on, and aren't I so spacious and generous? And it's just not the truth, And so for some of us listening in, being like, I don't even know, I feel like I'm maybe beyond this, or I've already moved out of this kind of Christianity or Christian politics. Again, there's so many of our family members and people in our beloved congregations and other that are still really swimming in this. And when we understand, they're probably even wrestling with some of it, many of them. And so part of what this book, I think, is designed to do is give people like us enough of an equipping to actually be able to offer some companionship to folk who are themselves beginning to ask a different set of questions about this unholy fusion of faith and religion and politics. I'm also thinking right now about how in my personal peacemaking practice, so much of my momentum is moving in the direction of white militia groups. And so my friend Oshita Moore says that our enemy is anyone who exists beyond the reach of our empathy. Or put another way, my enemy is whoever I don't mind if something bad happens to them, you know, and over time, I think that group evolves as we're actually expanding in what John A. Powell would say, our circle of human concern, you know, but there's still groups of people who exist beyond the reach of our empathy. For me, it has been not just like a white nationalist, it's the white militia, the people who are willing to pick up big guns and defend what they see as their rights and privileges. And so this book is helping me actually navigate into spaces with them, because I think it helps me understand some of their fervency and urgency. And here's what I'm finding is that what lies underneath all of it, all of the bravado and all of the guns and the willingness for violence and the don't tread on me flags and all of this stuff are deep-seated fears. But they're also like really big values. Like I want to raise my son and daughter into a world that they're free to be who they are, or they're not going to be told what to think. They're going to be cultivated to be thinkers, you know, or I want to be able to hand off a world to them where prosperity is an option, you know, and when we're in these conversations, we begin to recognize, oh, there's some stuff that we share in common here, but the hard work of breaking through the ideology to grow the currency of trust, to be in those kinds of relationships where maybe we can put down our guns figuratively and metaphorically and actually begin to bridge into relationship with one another, is the very hope of democracy. You know, I wonder how you would like interact with that a little bit, because I'm talking about this. We can talk about democracy at a institutional structural level and the politics and the governance of it all. And the fact of the matter is, I think democracy only works if we're building the currency of trust with people, especially with whom we disagree. Interact with that a little bit, David, if you would.
Yeah. Everybody who writes about democracy says that democracy is a culture. It's not just rules and laws and processes. And that culture has certain dimensions to it, like a certain amount of mutual trust and so kind of a trust in institutions, both of which are declining dramatically. And also a resolute commitment to avoid threatening speech and political violence. One of the things I noticed in studying the 1920s in Germany is the rise of militias. In Weimar Germany, the rise of militias on the left and on the right, and them beating each other up in the streets, that was one of the signs of the instability of that baby democracy. That whenever you see the guns coming out and heavily armed groups of people affecting political life in a democracy, then you have a warning sign. So the Proud Boys were an example of that, and there are others. So the militias, the militias, especially those that are believe that they are reflecting some Christian values, they are really worth studying and engaging. In the book, I argue that there are three main resources in the Christian you might say the Christian portfolio of tradition that we ought to remember and draw on. And these are the congregational democratic traditions. I identify them with the Baptists, but it's everybody who learns how to do democracy in a congregation. The tradition of covenant that is most associated with the Puritans, though we would want it to be, and then it went into the Baptists and the Anabaptists, and really wherever you have a covenantal understanding of community, you have a resource. You have to have an inclusive covenant, and this is something that the third tradition, the Black Christian democratic tradition, understood that the problem with the American constitutional order was it was not a covenant that had included them. Mm-hmm. It was also not a covenant that had included indigenous people. Mm-hmm. It had been a covenant for white men, basically, especially white male landowners. And so the struggle for democracy is a struggle to broaden the covenant so that everybody is included on equal terms. Mm-hmm. the most pessimistic reading of what we have right now is that the social changes since the 1960s, in some ways, have all been about broadening the covenant so that everybody is included. Women and gay people and people who are immigrants here, and indigenous people and Latinx people, and on equal terms. And that the reaction is, no, actually, the original terms of our Constitution is the one that we want. We want this to be a white Christian male country. Mm. And so that's really, I think, in some ways, the choice that we face. And in that heritage, if you look back at the long history of, like, for example, the Reconstruction period and so on, the use of violence to try to turn back the broadening of the franchise and the broadening of democratic citizenship is a long-standing pattern. Mm-hmm. Right? So anyway, in the book, I have a chapter on the congregational democratic tradition, and a chapter on covenantalism, and a chapter on the Black Christian resistance democratic tradition. You helped me to call this DCA, the Democratic, Covenantal, and Abolitionist Resources.
Yes.
And so part of the contribution of the book is to study those pretty closely and to say, let's have a contest of ideas between authoritarian reactionary Christianity and democratic and covenantal abolitionist Christianity. Let's have that conversation.
Yes, yes. And that's where we're going to go in this 3-part workshop, because when I didn't know that I coined that for you, I thought I was just saying the thing that you've already said, but you do such an incredible job laying out an analysis of ARC, authoritarian reactionary Christianity. And as I'm reading at the very end, I'm like, oh, and there's the hopeful alternative, democratized covenantal abolitionist. And what I love the most, and I want us all to dial into this in our reading of this book, is the notion that those three, democratic, covenantal, and abolitionists, those are the movements that are surfacing out of the communities of folks who have been marginalized by the abuse of power, by the abuse of authoritarianism and reactionaryism. And so where do we go to find the hopeful alternatives? Well, I think it's the places that have been actually holding us accountable to the ideals of democracy over time. It's the communities who have been marginalized by this level of power, who still actually believe that democracy is possible and believe that Jesus has something to say about how we embody that in a way that's righteous.
Yeah. So as I think about this is partly about a healthier version of Christianity. And really what you might say, the theologians from the margins and the voices from the margins have been saying, the Christian margins, is your version of Christianity is not really the way of Jesus. We challenge it.
Yes.
Okay. So we're talking about a healthier version of Christianity. When Christianity becomes kind of white ethno-tribalism, that has so nothing to do with Jesus, it has to be challenged, right? You know. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about a healthier version of Christianity. And there are some books right now that are talking about, like Andrew Whitehead's new book on American idolatry is really about the theological kind of stakes here, right?
Yeah.
And I've written about that kind of thing in the past. But then we're also talking about a healthier version of democracy. But I think by retrieving these resources, we can make strides in both directions. Healthier Christianity and healthier democracy.
Yes. So I want to pause the conversation for a minute and give you a second to peruse the Q&A. And there's also some really good questions in the comment section. Okay. So that we can look at those for the last 10 minutes or so of our time together. While David is doing that, I want to offer a couple of invitations here to the rest of us to continue this journey. And so, first and foremost, I really want to urge you to get this book. It's on the shelves. It's flying off the shelves right now. Get this, read it yourselves, use it with your teams, use it with your congregations, use it with your organizations, your small groups, your book studies. Get the book. Second invitation is that David and I, as I mentioned, are putting together a workshop. Session 1, it's a 3-part workshop. Session 1 happens on October the 18th. And let me hit what these 3 sessions are going to offer, what they're going to offer us. First, part one, we're going to understand authoritarian reactionary Christianity and learn to identify its impact on our faith, leadership, and institutions. So again, this isn't going to necessarily be so much of a looking out there. We're going to go to work to understand how it's actually influenced our own faith, our leadership, and the institutions that we're leading within. Part two on November 7, which is Election Day, a fitting day to be talking about these things. We're going to go deeper on understanding democracy and learning how to embrace our role as followers of Jesus in it beyond simply voting. And so that'll be part two. And then part three, we're going to locate, embody, and learn to guide expressions of democratized covenantal abolitionist Christianity. We're going to press into the hopeful alternative, where we're going to start to talk about this journey from fidelity to ARC to liberation into the restorative revolution that we've actually been invited into. So here's the last thing I'm going to say about this workshop is it's going to be deeper diving content, but think about it as a 3-week learning journey guided by David and I, where we're going to talk about these things together, and then we're going to train in these things together. This is for you, and we want to encourage you to bring other folks into your living room to have these conversations with us together. As I said, it's fully funded by our community of investors, but there's a suggested donation just for participation, and so you'll see that in the registration link. So registration is in the comment thread right now. The other thing I want to say is that we've just recently opened the application portal for our flagship leadership cohort called Journey of Hope. This is for shaping reconciling leaders who can renovate their organizations and institutions into instruments of peace. It's a 6-month leadership journey for high capacity seasoned leaders who are aware of the growing divides, are anxious about it, and are looking for next level formation and next level capacity as reconciling leaders. Not just for yourself, but to deploy within your institutions so that you can guide the renovation of your organizations and your institutions into instruments of peace that are participating in the repair of your contexts. 6 months long, representing rural, suburban, and urban, those locations, sectors all across the board, and it culminates with a 5-day immersion in the Deep South, where we're learning from legacy and contemporary civil rights heroes who are going to talk to us about the role of faith leadership, reconciling leadership in undoing what some of institutional racism has made. And then lastly, we just launched the Everyday Peacemaking podcast. Episode 1 launched last week with a conversation about rest. What do you do when you know that you need rest, but you failed to get it, and you find yourself weary, but needing to stay in the peacemaking trenches? So that was week 1. We just recorded today a conversation about bridging ideological difference, political difference within our families. So on the podcast, we're having visceral and vulnerable conversations about the hearts and the hopes and the heartaches of being everyday peacemakers. And so we encourage you to subscribe and listen in with us. It's a slow, steady stream of consciousness around what it means to be everyday peacemakers wherever we live, work, and play. And then the last word is our gratitude for our community of funders. They're called the Embers, the community. They make conversations like this possible, as well as the workshop that we'd like to see you be a part of here later this month. And so if you're interested in investing in peace through Global Immersion, you can find us at globalimmerse.org and become a part of our funding team. So there's some invitations for you to take the next steps along the way. David,
Yes.
what are you seeing in the Q&A, and what do you want to interact with us?
Oh, so many good things here. I shall try to answer 7 or 8 things, and I know we're about out of time at that point. I wanted to note one of our participants really honestly discussed the stress even in her marriage over these issues. Yeah. And so I want to say that I want to hear that. I want to name that. And I want to say it's everywhere. My students talk about the stresses in their families. I was talking with somebody at Wild Goose Festival this summer who said that her marriage is threatened, whether it will even survive, because their way of looking at these issues is so fundamentally different. When political differences threaten marriages and sibling relationships and parent-child relationships, you know you're in a really, really polarized environment. And so if we can help people understand each other and have rational conversations that have love in them, we're doing something for the society and also for families. Okay, so thank you. I think it was Lori who quoted the David Brooks article about why are we all so sad and mean. And I think actually the decline of Christian formation, oddly, and there are other people who are saying this too, is actually contributing to now you might call it scare quote Christian politics that doesn't have any of the virtues of Christianity. Just, you might say, the moral outrage without anything like love, joy, peace, patience. Remember Galatians 5? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. Some of us memorize that. And so if you have declining religious practice and all you have is something, all that survives is something more like negative cultural reaction, then Christianity becomes a less constructive force. But in general, I think disconnection, loss of trust, and despair, ginned up by propaganda in our media sources, helps people to become more sad and mean. Okay. Joanne asked about violence. Why are we now talking about violence? Well, I would say because the borderline has been breached, because we've actually seen it before our eyes. In the 60s, there were political assassinations, and we saw that, I mean, 3 major ones in a few years, and people feared that the society was coming apart at the seams. It kind of calmed down gradually. I think we're in a cycle where violence and threats of violence are picking up, and it's really about police work and stuff to try to prevent some of these things from actually happening. Anyway, the boundary has been breached. The talk of violence is in the air. Loose talk, threats, and also because people believe the stakes are so high, if they get to an apocalyptic enough place, they might believe that culture war needs to become actual war. And extremist groups, that's how they end up where they end up. I was asked about covenantalism in this context. This is a lost concept, but it's the idea that a community is constituted by the sacred promises of each member to the community and to each other, in which we say, we pledge to work together to create a certain kind of community. And for Christians, we could pledge this to God and to our neighbors. I quote the covenant of the Constitution of the state of Massachusetts. I mean, the Constitution describes what they're doing as forming a covenant of all the citizens. Now, the problem with these early kind of New England covenants, again, is they were Puritan influence and not everybody was included. Martin Luther King talked about the need for a new democratic covenant in which everybody is included. I also emphasize in that chapter that governmental leaders, from mayors to presidents to district attorneys to police captains, anybody who takes an oath, military leaders, need to articulate openly what it is that they have promised to do and to refrain from doing, and to invite people to hold them accountable to that. That's a covenant. David Hollinger asked me, why is there no evangelical leader support for, you might say, defending democracy? Well, there hasn't really been a movement formed yet, but it's devastating, really, David, that this just does not appear to be in the DNA of these organizations right now. They appear to be more attracted to what has sometimes been called Christian nationalist agendas, or they're afraid of their own people who are attracted to these movements. I call on the head of the National Association of Evangelicals and of evangelical denominations to especially those that have these traditions of covenant and dissent and democracy, to step forward and do their part. JD asks, why do we care about democracy? And there's a whole long theological tradition of thinking about the state. Augustine contributed here, Bonhoeffer contributed. There's lots of voices, but I'll just put it this way. I say this in the book. Because what kind of society we live in, what kind of government structure we live in, affects people's lives, we have to care about what the government system is and how it's operating. If we care about people who are unjustly imprisoned, we have to care about that. or people who are being tortured in custody. We have to care about that. It's love of neighbor. It's concern for the common good. Seek the well-being of the city in which you live. It's the biblical mandate for justice. It's not about perfecting any human political order, because that will not be perfected until Christ returns. But it's Bonhoeffer called it penultimate work for the bodily well-being and the common good of the communities in which we find ourselves. Donna asks, what is it that the people are afraid of? Is it loss of status? Is it religion? I think sometimes, and Nicholas talks about where is this related to advanced capitalism, sometimes it's loss of economic privilege, the role of competitors. It's the over shipping of jobs overseas, so there's economic dimensions. It's seeing lots of people who are not white and male in positions of leadership and being unsettled by that. It's the pluralizing and diversifying of power when a certain group of people is used to being in charge. And sometimes that gets identified with religion, and sometimes it doesn't. When it does get identified with religion, it makes it more difficult to dislodge. It becomes idolatrous, I would say, along with Andrew Whitehead. I use the word woke, not because I agree with that language, but because it is the language partly of the inflamed traditionalist side who believes that there is indeed an organized conspiracy, or at least a general cultural trend, to undermine traditional values, and to propagandize our children into those undermined, you might say, the new values. And I do think one thing I'm seeing in the literature is the conservative side is saying we've already lost liberal, as in free thinking, because the left is indoctrinating people into illiberal leftism. And so if it's going to be illiberal, well, let's just win and we'll indoctrinate people into illiberal traditionalism. Our side can win, their side must lose. We do need a recovery of some of those liberal values like freedom of speech and mutual respect and civility across difference of opinion and things like that. And that is a call to all of us, I think, in our society. So maybe I'll stop there. That's a lightning round of about 10 questions, but those were good things.
Amazing. Let me just let me ask you one final question then, because I could imagine that a critic would say, are you just advocating for the emergence of a new moral majority, this one adhering to DCA rather than ARC? And how would you interact with that person? And that would maybe accuse you of that. And then for those of us who are listening in, we talked about democracy needing to be defended. What is the internal work that we can do tonight to begin to move in defense of a future that is more righteous, more just, more kind, more joyful?
I would say that if you study democratic congregationalism and covenantal theology, politics, and ethics, that's a little bit of historical homework there. Anybody can do it. You could read the book as a place to start. And the Black Christian democratic tradition as it has evolved over 400 very hard years on these shores. There is some substance to the vision, like it's a substance in which everybody gets included. Everybody without exception gets included. And in which we really have moved beyond the idea that white men are supposed to be in charge of this society. Everybody has a share at the table. Everybody has a voice. And all of that. So yes, there is substance there. It's from hierarchy to equality. It's from exclusion to inclusion. It's from domination to mutual participation. That's a vision, and I stand by it. I think it's a biblical vision.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
But it's also about process. If you care about covenant, then thing about covenant is it's voluntary agreement to participate in a certain kind of community. And then you hash out what that community will be like together.
Right.
Right. And a democratic congregationalism under the lordship of Christ we all commit to follow him together in this church, and then we set up structures and constitutions and bylaws and votes and stuff, and we figure out how to do it together. So in a sense, the result is a result of the process, where however the Spirit leads and however the people decide. That I think is just better than authoritarianism. So it's both substance and process.
Yeah.
And
in a country, dare I say, world where I just think the Christian movement, I'll talk about this continent or this country, the fastest growing group of people are nuns, and most of these people are people who are walking away from manifestations of American Christianity for some of the reasons that you articulate in this book.
Yeah, you might say this book is a follow-up to my After Evangelicalism book.
I think it is. I think it does.
For that reason,
Yeah.
And it's also, you ask, what can we do? We can learn what this is that's not going well and have some language for it. We can learn about the fears. And whether we think these are legitimate fears, we can listen to them. We can listen. A lot of times in evangelicalism, we were trained in all the books, we read were like white guy authors, right? We can listen to other voices, right? We can get corrected from those we have marginalized in the past. This is an ongoing reform, even revolution in how we do Christian community and Christian scholarship. And we need a community of people to go on a journey with, to learn and to figure out how to engage as Christians and as democratic citizens in the upcoming 18 months, which is I think so pivotal. And then maybe for the rest of our lives, this journey is never over. So that's the start anyway.
Yeah. So for those you listening in, join us for the 3-part workshop. Let's take some significant next steps in community with one another, becoming substantively different kinds of people. So David, thank you for this. Thank you for this book, and looking forward to continuing to chew into it with you as we form into peacemakers in the way of Jesus together. So friends, thank you for joining us. We've listened, and that's so important. The question is, how are we going to allow this to impact us? We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to see you as a part of what's going on with this learning community beginning on October 18th. I think lives actually depend on us not just consuming this conversation, but being transformed by it. So toward that end, let's continue the journey. Friends, thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time.